Hey guys, Ryan here with Extreme Hardware. Today, I'm going to build an Intel PC that's not the most extreme, but still has some decent horsepower. ASRock was kind enough to send over their new H570 Steel Legend motherboard to use for this build, as well as bequiet with their 500DX high airflow compact ETX case. bequiet also sent over a few new offerings: a new gold rated power supply, the Pure Power 11 FM at 650 watts. And to cool the CPU is going to be bequiet's PureRock Slim 2, which has a 92mm fan and a high TDP of 130 watts. So why don't we run down the build list? So the CPU is an Intel i5-11600K. Motherboard is the ASRock H570 Steel Legend. With RAM, we went with T-Force Vulcan Z 16GB DDR4 3200 kit. That's 2x8GB. As a filler, I used a EVGA RTX 2060 Super SC Ultra. As a GPU, you can insert whatever you want in there. bequiet's Pure Power 11 FM 650 watt power supply, bequiet's PureRock Slim 2 CPU cooler, and bequiet's Pure Base 500DX case. Rounding out storage is Intel 660p 1TB NVMe M.2 SSD. So there's the parts list, and while I fully understand that some of these parts may seem off, it's what I had on hand to complete the build. I will, however, be providing links to some better, more cost-effective alternatives if I can find them. Also, something to note here, GPU prices are still stupid high, so I didn't bother pricing one out. If you have an old GPU to use while we all wait for the market to stabilize, I suggest going that route or looking at the secondhand market. So that makes a total without GPU $807 US, or 728 euros, which IMO isn't half bad in today's market. Next up, and quite undoubtedly the most questionable one, is the H570 Steel Legend motherboard by ASRock, which I'm going to admit, it wasn't my first choice if I was shopping for a new 500 series Intel motherboard. But if you look a little bit closer, the H570 Steel Legend looks like it shares the very same PCB and board circuitry as the H570 and Z590 Phantom Gaming 4 motherboards. Having support for PCIe 4.0 means you can get the full use out of a PCIe 4.0 GPU or M.2 SSD. Speaking of M.2 slots, one Hyper M.2 PCIe Gen 4x4 slot is located right above the reinforced steel PCIe 4.0 X16 slot, which also includes a heatsink. Two more Ultra M.2 slots are PCIe Gen 3 speeds are located just under the X16 slots. However, the second X16 slot is only wired at 4x. Power delivery on the H570 Steel Legend is actually pretty good for an entry-level budget motherboard with 8 power phases with premium 50 amp power chokes. So out of the three, the H570 Steel Legend does look the best IMO, but the H570 Phantom Gaming 4 is $22 cheaper, so there's that. Also keep note, you can still do some memory overclocking on the H570 chipset, which is a first for Intel to open up memory overclocking on an H-series motherboard. Moving on to the CPU cooler, that's easy. bequiet's PureRock Slim 2. It's stupid cheap and it's from a reputable cooling brand. That also brings me to the case, the Pure Base 500DX. You are not going to find a better full-featured tempered glass case that has better airflow unless you spend more money. In the world of PSUs, we are using bequiet's Pure Power 11 FM 650 watt. You can save a few bucks here and get a different name brand, which personally in this price bracket of $75 to $100, I would only consider Fractal's Ion or any one of EVGA's gold-rated power supplies if you couldn't get your hands on the Pure Power 11 FM. Lastly, memory and storage. Yeah, those are going to fluctuate. So I say pick up at least a 16GB 3200 MHz DDR4 kit and a 500GB SSD. All right, shall we commence with the build? I thought so. to wrap things up, this was an actually pretty easy build. Building in the Pure Base 500 or any other bequiet case for that matter is pretty much always is. ASRock's H570 Steel Legend motherboard is pretty solid even though it is an H series motherboard. Memory overclocking is still possible, as I was able to dial in my XNP profile to 3200 MHz pretty easily. Moving on to the CPU cooler, bequiet's PureRock Slim 2, which seemed to handle the 6-core 12-threaded Intel Core i5-11600K for the most part. What I mean is that temperatures were sustainable for the majority of the time when the CPU was under a normal workload. When stressed to 100%, however, CPU temps rose to 100°C quite quickly, which is quite toasty. The PSU, on the other hand, was rock solid. Total system draw when the CPU and GPU were stressed to 100% each was a little over 330 watts. The CPU alone actually sucked up 190 plus watts when it was boosting to almost 4.9 gigahertz. When the CPU started to thermal throttle, temps returned back to the high 70s and system power draw lowered about 40 watts. The GPU, thanks to the full-length cooler on the EVGA RTX 2060 Super SE Ultra, had a high of 65°C on the GPU with a hotspot reading of 79°C. Perfectly acceptable while maintaining a clock speed of 1965 MHz. So if I had to do it all over again, would I use the same parts? Mostly. I definitely would have spent a little bit more on a higher ended CPU cooler. The PureRock Slim 2 just wasn't enough to tame the 11600K at 4.9 GHz on a full load. Other than that, I think the build is beautifully balanced. Alright guys, thanks again to ASRock for sending over their H570 Steel Legend motherboard and to bequiet for the PureRock Slim 2 and PurePower 11 FM 650W PSU. If you guys don't mind, please like and subscribe to us. It is much appreciated. I will see you in the next one.